December 31st, 1970, President Nixon signs the Clean Air Act. With a stroke of a pen, American automotive engineering changes forever. The EPA is born, and Detroit's engineers suddenly have a new boss. Not the customer, not the enthusiast, the government. What follows is a decade-long engineering nightmare where the sole priority shifts from building powerful, reliable engines to simply passing emissions tests. And in that desperate scramble, Detroit churns out some of the worst engines in American automotive history. Today, we're counting down the top 5 engines that Detroit built to satisfy regulators, not drivers. These aren't just underpowered disappointments. These are cautionary tales of what happens when engineering priorities get turned completely upside down. Let's kick things off with an engine so forgettable most people don't even know it existed. The Ford 255 cubic inch V8, or as it was marketed, the 4.2-liter. In 1980, Ford was staring down the barrel of CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy regulations that demanded automakers achieve 27.5 miles per gallon across their entire fleet by the mid-1980s. The solution? Take the proven 302 Windsor V8 and bore it down, way down. The 255 was essentially a 302 with the cylinder bores shrunk from 4 inches to just 3.68 inches. Ford kept the same 3-inch stroke, but with smaller bores came smaller valves, smaller combustion chambers, and a milder camshaft. The result was an engine that produced a whopping 115 to 122 horsepower, depending on the application. To put that in perspective, the 302 it replaced made 140 horsepower just a year earlier. But here's the kicker. The fuel economy wasn't even that much better. Some variants, like the one in the Mercury Grand Marquis with a variable Venturi carburetor, could achieve 27 miles per gallon on the highway. But in typical driving, you were lucky to see low 20s. All that engineering effort for maybe 2 or 3 mpg improvement over the 302. The 255 found its way into a surprising number of Ford products: the F100 and F150 trucks, the LTD, Thunderbird, Mercury Cougar, and perhaps most tragically, the Mustang. That's right, in 1980 and 1981, if you wanted a V8 Mustang, you got the 255. No options, the only V8 available. And it was mated exclusively to a 3-speed automatic transmission. Mustang enthusiasts still wince at the memory. Quarter-mile times in the 18-second range. 0 to 60 in about the same time it takes to read this sentence. One owner described it as, "The 255 can barely outrun the pistons falling out of it." Ouch! The engine had unique cylinder heads that weren't compatible with other Windsor family engines, which meant the aftermarket basically ignored it. Want a hot rod your 255? Good luck finding parts. Most owners who cared about performance simply swapped in a 302 and called it a day. Ford recognized the mistake quickly. By 1982, the 255 was gone, and the 302 was back in production. Total production? About 253,000 units across 3 model years. Ford's own engineers later called it one of the worst modern Ford engines ever produced. The 255 represents the classic EPA-era mistake, sacrificing everything that made an engine good in pursuit of marginal fuel economy gains. It was underpowered, unloved, and mercifully short-lived. If the Ford 255 was a disappointment, the Oldsmobile 5.7-liter diesel V8 was an absolute catastrophe. This engine didn't just fail, it single-handedly killed the American diesel passenger car market for the next 30 years and literally spawned the creation of lemon laws in several states. In the late 1970s, with CAFE standards looming and diesel fuel considerably cheaper than gasoline, GM saw an opportunity. Mercedes-Benz had been successfully selling diesel passenger cars for years. Why couldn't GM? The diesel would help meet fuel economy requirements while maintaining the smooth, torquey character that luxury car buyers expected. On paper, it was brilliant. In execution, it was a disaster from day one. Here's where GM went wrong. Instead of designing a proper diesel engine from the ground up, which would have required new tooling and significant investment, Oldsmobile took their existing 350 cubic inch gasoline V8 and converted it to run on diesel. They kept the same bore spacing, the same deck surface area, and critically, the same head bolt pattern and quantity. Let that sink in. A diesel engine has compression ratios roughly 3 times higher than a gasoline engine. The Olds diesel ran a compression ratio of 22.5 to 1, but GM used essentially the same number and size of head bolts as the gas engine. They were engineering in failure from the start. The head bolts simply couldn't handle the cylinder pressures. They would pull right out of the aluminum threads, causing catastrophic head gasket failures. And that was just problem number one. To save costs, GM also decided not to install a water separator in the fuel system. In the late 1970s, diesel fuel quality was inconsistent at best, and water contamination was common. Without a water separator, the injector pumps would corrode and fail. The timing chain that ran the fuel pump would stretch. The crude oil pumps would fail. It was a cascade of reliability issues. The engine debuted in 1978, producing 120 horsepower in cars and 125 in trucks, already anemic for a 5.7-liter V8. By 1980, output dropped to just 105 horsepower and 205 pound-feet of torque. 0 to 60 times were in the 18 to 20-second range. These were full-size luxury cars that could barely merge onto the highway. But the lack of power was nothing compared to the reliability nightmare. Owners reported engines failing at 20,000 miles, 30,000 miles. Some didn't even make it that far. Dealership service departments were flooded with failed diesels. Mechanics, untrained on diesel engines, would often misdiagnose and incorrectly repair them. Even when fixed properly, the underlying design flaws meant another failure was just around the corner. The California Air Resources Board couldn't certify the diesel for sale in California in 1979 and early 1980, not because of emissions, but because every single test car broke down before testing could be completed. Of the 9 cars supplied to CARB, all 9 suffered engine problems and 7 had transmission failures. Think about that, a 100% failure rate. Class action lawsuits piled up. Grassroots consumer groups formed specifically to battle GM over this engine. The Federal Trade Commission filed complaints. Several states drafted the first lemon laws specifically in response to this disaster. Resale values on diesel-equipped cars collapsed, leaving owners stuck with worthless vehicles. To GM's credit, they eventually fixed most of the issues. In 1981, they introduced the DX block with reinforcements and improvements. By the engine's final years, it was actually reasonably reliable, but it was too late. The damage to GM's reputation was done. The engine was discontinued in 1985 after sales peaked in 1981 at 310,000 units, 60% of the entire U.S. diesel passenger market, before collapsing. One Oldsmobile engineer who worked on the project reportedly told his bosses not to release the engine. GM needed to meet CAFE standards, so they forced him into early retirement and released it anyway. The Olds diesel haunted GM for decades. Even today, when you mention American diesel passenger cars, people's minds go straight to this catastrophe. It's the textbook example of what happens when you rush an untested design to market to meet regulatory deadlines. Variable displacement, cylinder deactivation. It's everywhere in modern engines, from your neighbor's Honda to the Hemi in a Ram pickup. It works seamlessly, saves fuel, and most drivers never even notice it happening. In 1981, Cadillac tried to do this with 1970s technology. It didn't go well. The Cadillac V8-6-4, officially called the L62, was a technological marvel on paper. Take a proven 368 cubic inch V8 and equip it with a computer-controlled system that could deactivate 2 or 4 cylinders depending on load. Under heavy acceleration, you'd have all 8 cylinders. Cruising on the highway, the computer would shut down to 6 or even 4 cylinders, dramatically improving fuel economy. Best of both worlds. The reality was far different. The electronic control unit was primitive by today's standards. We're talking early microprocessor technology trying to manage something incredibly complex. The system worked by using solenoids to lock down rocker arms, which prevented intake and exhaust valves from opening. This trapped air in the deactivated cylinders to act as a cushion. The transitions between modes were rough. Drivers reported constant hesitation and lurching as the engine hunted between 8, 6, and 4-cylinder operation. In 6-cylinder mode, the engine would shake badly due to uneven firing intervals. In 4-cylinder mode, it sounded like it was dieseling. Cadillac even included a dashboard gauge called the MPG Sentinel that showed how many cylinders were currently active. It turned out to be completely unnecessary because drivers could instantly tell by the lurching and vibration exactly how many cylinders were firing. And here's the really fun part. Fuel would pool on top of the intake valves during steady-state cruising when cylinders were deactivated. Then, when those cylinders reactivated, all that pooled fuel would dump back into the combustion chamber at once. Not exactly optimal for smooth operation or emissions. For all this technological complexity and drivability issues, what did owners get? A paltry 15% improvement in real-world fuel economy. That's it. Maybe 2 mpg better than a conventional V8. Cadillac dealerships were flooded with complaints. The company tried 13 different software updates to improve drivability, but they simply couldn't overcome the limitations of early 1980s computer technology. Despite sending reassuring letters to owners and offering a 5-year, 50,000-mile warranty extension specifically for the V8-6-4, Cadillac pulled the plug after just 1 model year. Well, almost. The V8-6-4 continued in low-production Fleetwood limousines through 1984, but for passenger cars, it was gone. Most owners who kept their 1981 models had dealerships disable the cylinder deactivation system entirely, turning it into a full-time V8. From a mechanical standpoint, the 368 cubic inch engine underneath was actually excellent, a solid, reliable Cadillac V8 from their proven big block family. The variable displacement hardware itself didn't affect reliability when disabled. The problem was purely the execution of the cylinder deactivation system. Here's the irony. Cadillac had actually decided to discontinue the V8-6-4 before the 1981 models even launched. Even with cylinder deactivation, the engine couldn't avoid the gas guzzler tax for 1982, when the threshold rose from 17 mpg to 18.5 mpg. So this whole experiment was doomed from the start. A stopgap technology rushed to market to meet 1981 CAFE requirements, knowing full well it would be replaced in 1982. The V8-6-4 represents the hubris of the era. Detroit convinced it could leapfrog technological limitations through sheer engineering willpower. The idea was sound, the concept was prophetic, but the execution was a decade too early, and customers became unwitting beta testers for technology that simply wasn't ready. In many ways, this failure paved the way for the next disaster on our list. When the V8-6-4 failed spectacularly, Cadillac had a problem. They needed a new fuel-efficient engine to replace their troublesome variable displacement V8, and they needed it immediately. The solution was the HT4100. HT standing for high technology. The irony of that name would become painfully apparent. The HT4100 was originally scheduled to debut in the downsized 1985 DeVille, But with the V8-6-4 disaster unfolding, GM engineers worked overtime to pull development ahead by 3 years. That rushed timeline should have been a red flag. On paper, the HT4100 looked promising. It was a modern, all-aluminum V8 with electronic fuel injection, displacing 4.1 liters and producing 135 horsepower. It featured replaceable cylinder sleeves, sophisticated engine management, and bimetal construction with cast iron heads on an aluminum block to save weight. Wait, back up. Cast iron heads on an aluminum block? That's backwards from virtually every other bimetal engine design. Most use aluminum heads on iron blocks because aluminum dissipates heat better at the combustion chamber. Cadillac did the opposite. This created a fundamental problem. The different thermal expansion rates between the aluminum block and iron heads caused the intake manifold gasket to fail repeatedly due to scrubbing at the bimetal interface. Head gaskets would blow. And here's the worst part. The head bolts would literally pull the aluminum threads right out of the block under the stress. The HT4100 also suffered from aluminum oil pump failures, cam bearing displacement, and weak aluminum block castings. Coolant would leak into the crankcase, creating a milkshake effect in the oil. The engine was prone to overheating, parts were expensive, and many repair shops refused to work on them. For Cadillac buyers between 1982 and 1985, this was their only gasoline V8 option. The alternatives? The still problematic V8-6-4 in limousines, the catastrophic Oldsmobile 5.7 diesel, or the 4.1-liter Buick V6. The Buick V6 wasn't as refined as a V8, but it was reliable and problem-free, making it the de facto choice for informed buyers. And get this, the Buick V6 actually made the same 125 horsepower as the HT4100 while producing more torque. So the high-technology V8 was being outperformed by a conventional V6. Acceleration was anemic. We're talking high 7 to low 8 seconds 0 to 60 times in the best conditions. In a fully loaded sedan DeVille with passengers, forget about merging onto the highway with authority. The HT4100 struggled to move these heavy luxury cars with anything resembling confidence. Cadillac sales somehow stayed above 300,000 units annually through 1986, despite these engine problems, largely on the strength of the brand's reputation. But that reputation was being systematically destroyed with every HT4100 failure. Owners who could afford it swapped in Oldsmobile gas V8s, a straightforward conversion that instantly made the car more reliable and pleasant to drive. The HT engine designation became so tarnished that when Cadillac enlarged the engine to 4.5 liters in 1988 with significant improvements, they dropped the HT branding entirely. Nobody wanted that association. The 4.5 and later 4.9-liter versions were actually pretty good engines by the early 1990s, but by then the damage was done. The HT4100 had cemented Cadillac's slide from standard of the world to standard of the recall. This engine represents everything wrong with rushing technology to market. The HT4100 was designed to be revolutionary, lightweight, fuel-efficient, electronically sophisticated, but proper development and testing were sacrificed to meet an arbitrary deadline created by the V8-6-4's failure. The result was an engine that failed in almost every way that mattered to customers. Wait, you might be thinking, didn't we already cover these? Yes, separately, but here's why they're number one together. In 1981, these two disasters happened simultaneously, creating what might be the single worst year in American automotive engineering history. Picture this. You're shopping for a new Cadillac in 1981. You have 3 engine options. Option 1, the brand new V8-6-4 with variable displacement that lurches, hesitates, and hunts for the right cylinder count while delivering minimal fuel economy improvement. Option 2, the Oldsmobile 5.7-liter diesel that's already failing catastrophically in the field with head gasket failures, injection pump problems, and a reputation so bad that California won't even let it be sold in the state. Option 3, the Buick V6. That's it. Those are your choices. Two fundamentally flawed, problem-plagued engines that were rushed to market to satisfy EPA regulations, or a V6 in your flagship luxury car. GM was simultaneously deploying two of the worst engines in automotive history across its luxury lineup. The company that had built the standard of the world was now selling cars with engines that couldn't be trusted to make it through a warranty period. The combination of these failures represents the absolute nadir of Detroit engineering, the moment when regulatory compliance completely overwhelmed common sense, proper testing, and customer satisfaction. Both engines were born from desperate attempts to meet CAFE standards and emissions regulations without the time or resources to do it properly. The Olds diesel was sold across GM's entire lineup: Chevrolet, Buick, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac. The V8-6-4 was Cadillac exclusive, but together they appeared in hundreds of thousands of vehicles from 1978 through 1985 for the diesel and 1981 for the V8-6-4. What makes this the #1 entry isn't just that both engines were terrible, it's what they represent. This was the moment Detroit's engineering priorities became completely inverted. Instead of building the best possible engine and then figuring out how to make it meet regulations, they were building to pass regulatory tests first and hoping the result would be acceptable to customers. It wasn't. The lawsuits, the recalls, the warranty claims, the Federal Trade Commission complaints, the creation of lemon laws, all of it stemmed from this period. GM's market share began a decades-long decline. Customer loyalty evaporated. The damage to American automakers' reputation for quality and reliability took a generation to repair. Even today, mention American diesel to most people, and they'll immediately think of the Olds disaster. That's a 40-plus year stain on the industry's reputation from a handful of bad decisions made in the late 1970s. These 5 engines, the Ford 255, the Oldsmobile 5.7 diesel, the Cadillac V8-6-4, the Cadillac HT4100, and the combination of the diesel and V8-6-4 disasters represent a dark chapter in American automotive history. They're proof that good intentions aren't enough. They're evidence that rushing to meet regulatory deadlines without proper development time leads to disaster. They're cautionary tales about what happens when engineering priorities get turned upside down. The irony? The regulations these engines were built to satisfy, the Clean Air Act, CAFE standards, emissions requirements, were necessary and ultimately beneficial. Since 1974, carbon monoxide emissions have been reduced by 85%, hydrocarbons by 96%, NOx by over 99%, and particulate matter by over 99%. Modern engines are cleaner, more powerful, and more efficient than anything from this era. But getting there required Detroit to learn some expensive lessons. These engines were the tuition payment for that education. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into automotive history interesting, drop a like and subscribe for more deep dives into classic American engines, the good, the bad, and the catastrophically awful.